Niobrara's DEB is a serial to Ethernet bridge. In this example, we have a Magellan HMI polling two Modbus serial slaves. The power logic meter is slave address 1, while the momentum I/O is slave 2. We are adding the DEB to allow a new Ethernet client to access these Modbus slaves. The DEB simply snaps onto the DIN rail. 24-volt DC powers the unit, and the Ethernet cable is standard 100 base T. We will move the 2-wire RS-485 cable from the HMI to port 1 of the DEB. The DEB's RS-485 ports support 2-wire operation by jumpering the transmit pairs to the receive pairs. We add a new 2-wire cable between port 2 of the DEB and the HMI. Again, we jumper the transmit and receive pairs at the DEB's RS-485 serial port. Connecting the slaves to port 1 of the DEB and the HMI to port 2 of the DEB allows us to use the default Modbus routing tables. This makes the DEB setup very simple through the front panel. The HMI and both slaves are configured for 19.2 kbaud and even parity. We will set both DEB ports to match. The baud rates for both ports are changed from 9600 to 19200. The port modes for both ports are changed from RS-232 to RS-485. Port 1 is the master for the serial slaves, so it has bias enabled. Port 2 is acting like a slave to the HMI, so its bias is turned off. Inspecting the Modbus routes for port 2 shows index 1 routes out port 1 to slave 1. Index 2 targets slave 2 on port 1. We will now set the IP address for the DEB to 192.168.1.19. Autofill IP tables is useful when the DEB is a TCP client, which is covered in another video. The subnet mask is set to 255.255.255.0. Applying the mask automatically fills in most of the default gateway. We now just fill in the last octet of the default gate. Inspecting the Modbus routes for the Ethernet port shows that index 1 routes to slave 1 on port 1 and index 2 routes to slave 2 on port 1. We are now finished with the DEB configuration. Notice that the HMI is once again polling the two slaves. The kWh values are incrementing on the display. We now will use the Nerd Tool Windows program to read Modbus registers in both slaves, while the HMI is actively polling. The DEB does the arbitration between the Ethernet and HMI messages, allowing both to access the same slaves. Let's take a close look at the PC window. We open a Modbus TCP connection to the DEB's IP address. Choose slave 1 to access the power logic meter. Open a second connection to the DEB with slave 2 to access the momentum KYZ counter. The power logic energy values are in units of watt-hours and stored in registers 1621 through 1624 in modulo 10,000 format. The KYZ counter shows the data in 1/10 watt-hours in register 2. We can see that both slaves are showing values of around 4,865 kilowatt-hours. One more look at the HMI shows the same values. Please visit Niobrara.com for more information.